G'day, legends. I hope that you are having a fantastic day and we're getting closer to the weekend. I can feel it coming. But I hope that you are having a great week. And if you're going on school holidays, then you have a fantastic time. So today we're going to look at the maps. Of course, that'll be in the second half of the video. We do have some to go over. We're going to look at a peace summit that will be happening in the next month or two. We're going to look at the laws of armed conflict. We're going to talk about conscription, Patriot systems, and some new electronic motorcycles that we've seen on the front line. We've got a fair bit to go over, and as well with an international criminal lawyer, we'll be discussing some of this laws of armed conflict, what is being broken, what obligations that the West, that Ukraine, that Russia actually have to maintain and investigate in this that, in my opinion, we're just not seeing. So that'll be in about the middle of the video if you just like to skip through. But let's talk about conscription. Now, I just want to point out that if you don't want to be conscripted, here is me joining the circus to then not be conscripted. As we do know, people working in that industry then don't have to be mobilized. But more has come out about conscription. So last week we spoke about that the Minister for Defenders' Rights was sacked by Zelensky, and then we got the news that the demobilization and the rotation of these troops was removed as well. And this has led many to come to the conclusion that the only way to be demobilized is by being killed or wounded, or you'll see 200 or 300. And many are saying that they've become a slave to the state. So what is actually going to change in this conscription? We're going to talk about Russian conscription as well. So the Rada has begun considering an updated mobilization bill. Of course, this has proposed 4,000 amendments to the bill that came through on Feb 7th, but it has removed the provisions of demobilization and rotation of military personnel. The latter points, so these two, are to be developed separately from the main bill. Incredibly important for the morale of not only those men in the country who could be mobilized, but those that have been mobilized as well. That is incredibly important. If you don't have a time frame of what you're working to, or an overarching goal or realistic goal of what's working to, the morale is going to suffer there. And already mobilized conscripted soldiers, there's a problem with the effectiveness of those soldiers to begin with, that if they haven't volunteered, then they obviously don't want to be there. Ukraine's asking for everyone to volunteer, and if people aren't volunteering and then they're mobilized, well, you're starting from not the best maybe place of learning and into combat where you could lay down your life as well. This isn't some random, front line in the desert somewhere. This is the most challenging front line that we've seen in decades. So those are very, very important once they get developed. We'll be definitely looking on this. But what we do know as well is, of course, that age bracket has been dropped from 27 to 25. That doesn't unlock too many numbers. We know where the bulk of the population sits there, of the male population. I'll put up a thing here. But also that now citizens can serve after being convicted of a minor offence, as well as those who have been deemed for restricted service then will be medically re-examined and see if then they can re-enter service. So, of course, all this is just a push to conscript more men. Now, originally we were hearing numbers from 450,000 to 500,000, but we truly don't know that figure yet. But we know that figure of however many will be conscripted will have replacement for killed and wounded on the front line, as well as on top for if Ukraine want to launch some level of offensive. So we had more footage come out as well from the border guards of out near Odessa somewhere of 7 Ukrainian men trying to then flee the country. Supposedly had paid 80,000 hryvnias each to then cross, and then by drones and patrols here are picked up and then arrested from here. We do know there has been a lot of people trying to cross that border illegally due to 18 to 6-year-old men cannot leave, but trying to get across, trying to pay their way out. We know that officials have been caught up in corruption schemes of this as well, and that men are locked into here and trying to keep people in. Now, Russia also is conscripting guys, as we've seen before. Now, this first point in here, this is nothing new. This happens every year, that from 18 to 30 group are conscripted this spring, which is consistent with the numbers conscripted previously. So 150,000 here. They'll serve for 12 months, but They're employed to garrisons in land units and are likely to serve in Russia adjacent to the border, but a lot of these won't serve then in frontline areas, as far as this is saying, to risk combat casualties among conscript soldiers, which would be unpopular. But Russia seeks to recruit around 400,000 contract service personnel, so seems to recruit, not mobilise conscript. In 2024, this is sustained in forces in Ukraine, which have suffered huge losses, and support its announced plans to increase the size of the armed forces to 1.5 million. So Russia has had, of course, a lot of killed and wounded, and there's going to have people medically unfit. So there will be a level of conscription as well as an increase in trying to recruit more people to go onto the front line. And with what we're seeing at the front line at the moment, if you're from the outside looking in at where the map is moving, this is why Ukraine is having recruitment issues. Things are not looking good on the front line. The money is stuck. There's political issues. There's more pushback in the media. The Russian front line continues to inch, and it will be easier for Russia, I believe, to recruit people, not conscript, but recruit after what happened in Moscow. Whatever your opinion on that is irrelevant to, it will be used as a recruiting push, as well as seeing further successes daily on the front line. And we'll show you the maps and how then that is further moving. Now, we need to talk about a peace summit that is happening in Switzerland. Now, firstly, what I just want to say off is peace summits in 5-star hotels are useless other than money spending without Russia's involvement or China's involvement. Especially right now, Russia is currently winning the war. They hold the initiative in every direction on the front line, and they hold the initiative in industrial production of shells and other capabilities, of course helped by North Korea and China. But they hold that initiative, that if that party who's moving on the front line is not having the shell issues, if they're not invited to the party to play, it's a waste of time and money, my belief, other than getting maybe more support. But let's have a look over this, and of course what Zelensky has said about former President Donald Trump. That agreeing in January to host a peace summit at the request of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Switzerland announced on Wednesday the international conference is planned here at the 5-star Bjorgenstock, I'm guessing that's how it's pronounced, hotel near Lake Lucerne. The first step is to develop a common understanding among the participating states with a view to achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. The conference aims to establish a forum for a high-level dialogue on ways to achieve comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine in accordance with international law and the UN Charter. It aims to create a common understanding of a framework favourable to this objective and a concrete roadmap for Russia's participation in the peace process. Now, in this as well, that Russia is unlikely to participate. This is from Swiss media in the first round. Russia has signalled early on that it was not interested. Moscow says it was pointless and doomed to fail if it doesn't take Russia's interests into account. So you can see where Russia is coming from in this. They're going, well, if you're not going to take any of what we see into account, why would we turn up? If it's based on the Ukrainian 10-point peace plan, that the number one in that Russia is not happy with, well, where is it going to go from there? It says the proposed meeting in Switzerland is a ruse being used by the West to try and rally international support for Ukraine among the global South. And what we do know with sanctions on Russia and oil and trade between Russia and the West basically being stopped, that it has pushed Russia closer to the global South, to China, and they've pushed them then closer together. And that is a concern overall. The same reason we see that the US doesn't want strikes on facilities in Russia is not only that then Biden will have gas and oil prices go up, but that it does then push Russia's reliance, or either way, closer to China and other countries. And it is important for Ukraine and the West to try and maintain support there, or get support there. Moscow has roundly rejected Zelensky's peace formula. It says it is willing to enter talks about Ukraine, but that these must respect Russia's security interests and reflect what it calls the new realities on the ground, where its forces control just under a fifth of the country, and Moscow has claimed 4 Ukrainian regions as its own. And let's take this realities on the ground. The reality on the ground is what I spoke about before. Russia is having incremental gains in every direction that they are currently pushing, and they've got the upper hand in the shell production and being domestically produced, or with allies North Korea, Iran, China. But that is the reality on the ground. That needs to be taken into account for a peace summit. Otherwise, it is a ruse to gain more support. And I'm not against things to gain more support, but the banner of a peace summit, blah, 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 well, what will come of this? A lot of this is what we want, but what are we going to have? Now, let's talk about Trump, who is in the running to become the president potentially at the end of the year, along with now President Biden. Zelensky said Tuesday privately urged Trump through intermediaries to travel to Ukraine. Trump's expressed interest, but nothing is on the table yet. If the deal is that we just give up our territories, and that's the idea behind it, then it's a very primitive idea. I need very strong arguments. I don't need a fantastic idea. I need a real idea, because people's lives are at risk. Well, right now, with how the front line is looking, a fantastic, fanatic idea looks at when all the territories are then recovered, that if you wanted, a peace plan, if that is, quick, that comes in the next months, or with, if Trump was to get in, well, he's going to have something to do with land concessions. Unless Ukraine get tens and tens of billions of dollars, far beyond the 60 billion that is potentially coming from the US, and it's going to have to be more than that, and as well, you can't see any problems. It's going to continue. It's going to have to continue at grant. If that isn't promised, it's not there, then there's going to have to be some concession in this. And I think more people are coming around to the reality of, is there going to be something? Now, I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying it's just. I'm not saying it's legal. But I'm saying we need to take into account the realities that are on the ground. Now, Zelensky swerved at times between expressing impatience with Western allies that have not delivered military aid readily enough. He faulted Germany most explicitly. I don't think Germany should be faulted the most when you're talking about maybe Taurus systems. But if you look at the amount of Patriots, which we'll talk about in a second, Germany, compared to how many they've got to how many delivered, is far beyond any other country. Same with a lot of other systems. Just because I don't want to give a singular system of the Taurus. Yeah, anyway. Ukraine is under considerable pressure to show new progress in this war. Of course, it is coming into elections. If it's stalled, if Russia's making ground, what are people from the outside looking in going to see on this? Now, I want to talk about laws of armed conflict, the rules of war, the laws of war. People say it's silly, and those people that say it's silly have obviously never served in the militaries. Now, it seems that footage basically daily comes out of young men being executed by the opposing side. These are obviously blatant, published war crimes. The publishing and celebration of this is incredibly concerning. And due to how much we see then being published and shared, well, how much is not being published? How great is this behind what we see then on our screens? And it does prove that there is some systemic nature of this through then the celebration. Now, earlier this week, we got footage of a Russian soldier shooting into lifeless bodies down in Thankyou, of course, on the left bank of the Dnipro. And this footage seemed to be just post-execution of Ukrainian soldiers. But we get videos of Russian or Ukrainian soldiers shooting soldiers. Although these aren't, rare, they're nowhere near as common as the majority being Ukrainian footage of drones executing, surrendering, or become non-combatant soldiers through injuries of Russians via drones. The footage I see of these targeting guys who are either hands up or they're wounded to the degree of which they're now not a combatant is majority Ukraine. I'm not saying that Russia hasn't done it. I'm not saying that Russia hasn't committed vast and horrific war crimes in this war. But I'm saying of that type of footage, that is what I see the most. And this is a war crime regardless of what you think. And I'm going to have a lawyer on right now to talk about this. So I saw this last night. It was #1 trending on my Twitter last night and today, of this Russian guy here then praying with no weapon in sight. There's no mercy for genocidal murders. Should have stayed at home. And then one of the top comments here was, "You're not a soldier. You're a virgin groupie with no identity. You live vicariously through the guys who are fighting, willingly or unwillingly. If you had the balls, you'd be over there fighting. Instead, you mock a soldier who pleads to his Orthodox brothers on the other side." And we see this. The guys that are sharing this, putting around, they're not the ones out in the mud doing this. Now, even from a NAFOC, and I believe surrender should be accepted whenever possible. This is one of the things what differentiates us from Rust bots, from the Russians. We're going to talk about why Ukraine needs to be held to a higher standard. Well, both sides should be held to the higher standard, but why we still need to hold Ukraine to a standard. Now, this one says, and this is a common thing that I see, and we're going to talk about this with a lawyer, there was no one there to accept his surrender. Those surrendering to drone videos are heartwarming, but it isn't the reality most of the time. You need to have circumstance that would give a reasonable chance to the person taken into Ukrainian custody. Untrue. Anyway, you have to surrender to someone that can accept his surrender and take him under control. A drone or aircraft cannot do that. Glenn here is an international criminal lawyer and defense analyst who has spent time in many areas of operation around the world, including in Ukraine. If you'd like to watch the full podcast with him, I'll then link that below.
The reconnaissance drone is looking at what is clearly an injured guy. You know, he's laying around, he's got no weapon, he's clearly combat ineffective. And what happens is this reconnaissance drone is filming, and a drone delivered piece of ordnance that you can see there front and or top left-ish of the screen gets dropped right next to his heading.
As a soldier, I see this no differently to someone being wounded and you walking up and shooting them. Execution style, that is completely out of the rule book. That is, you know, you cannot do that. But I have a lot of people too in my audience who are going, well, firstly, warfare like this with drones on this level is a fairly new thing. Yes, we've seen it in other warfares, but it's also fairly new. That if there's no reasonable way of taking him POW or giving aid, how does that then change the scenario? Because if this is in no man's land, middle of nowhere, you can't reasonably take this person as a prisoner, that he can't actually surrender. Can he surrender to a drone?
Law is slow to keep up, but in this case, it's had to pull its finger out and try and keep up. And these are classic point. These are perfect examples. We started fundamental IHL first, right? So fundamental LOAC. We'll go back to first principles. First principle is that, and we'll say that you're right, he's surrendering, right? But even if he wasn't, if he was wounded, either way, he's hors de combat, he's out of combat. And you can't target somebody who's out of combat. The hors de combat wounded soldier goes back a long way pre any contemplation of drones putting things on people, right? So that was the soldier coming up going, wounded guy, don't kill him, take him away and treat him, right? Drone's not going to take him away and treat him. So let's just put that aside for the moment, the fact that he's wounded, even though I say that the obligation is still there not to blow him up. But the surrendering bit is the more powerful piece here, I think. Ukraine has a program called Will to Live, I think, or something.
I want to live, maybe?
I want to live. And they put this stuff out to, it's a PSYOP thing, put it out to all the Ruskies and said, if you surrender, our drones will guide you into a certain location and blah, blah, blah. And there'll be Ukrainian soldiers there to meet you. All well and good. I want to live. Yeah, that's what it's called. All well and good. The point about whether you can surrender to a drone, the US have said that any surrender, they've said this all along before even the drone space, right? There must be a clear expression from the US doctrine. There must be a clear expression of the intention to surrender. And that reflects what's in the additional protocol, so the Geneva Convention protocols, where it says that you can't make a person who clearly expresses an intention to surrender the object of attack. So just going back to the fundamentals, right? Was there a clear expression for him to surrender? I think so. He was wounded anyway, right? He's out of the fight. So by doing this stuff, he knew the drone was there. Clearly, he's looking up at it. Well, I think he's looking up at it, but he's certainly gesturing to something, right? I think that's a pretty clear expression of an intention to surrender. So on Article 41 of the protocol, so, pre-drone, this law still good law, was he the object of attack? Absolutely, right? The other point, and you raised this quite correctly, is could he actually physically, can you surrender to a drone? The feasibility of surrendering to a drone. If he wasn't wounded, if he was just there, put his weapon down and said, I surrender, well, really what? So what? The drone can't take him in. Like the drone can't take the weapon off him, search him and march him in. So is that a feasible, even though he's clearly expressed an intention to surrender, is that feasible that he can surrender and be taken into captivity? the fact that Ukraine, this is where I think it goes the way I think you're going, Willie, is the fact that Ukraine have these protocols in place where they say, tell the Russians, follow the drone or do this or do that, and it will, then the Ukrainians will meet you there. They've put protocols in place to enable surrendering to drones. So they're clearly contemplating surrendering to drones, which means, the other side of the coin is that they're clearly contemplating not making somebody who's surrendering to a drone an object of attack. So on that imagery, not just the wounded thing just aggravates it, I think, but I think they've breached the fact that they've implemented this process tells me that they think that Ukraine thinks you can, or Ukraine knows you can surrender to a drone. Therefore, that little logistical problem is no longer relevant, and I think they've breached the protocol rule against making a surrendering person object of attack. You can't look at one and go, naughty Russia, nothing to see here, Ukraine, right? We say naughty Russia, and we say potentially, potentially naughty Russia, potentially naughty Ukraine. Let's start looking at the evidence, establish the facts, and then apply the law to those facts. Starting point with the war of aggression is not going to be prosecuted by, if Russia's ever hit with this aggressive war charge, or the Russian leadership, it won't be prosecuted by Ukraine, and it won't be prosecuted by the ICC. That's my prediction based on the law as it stands, right? I just don't think it's viable. It'll be a standalone tribunal. The more on the ground sort of war crimes, ICC does have jurisdiction. ICC has investigators on the ground now, have had some time. Even though Russia's not a party to the Rome Statute, Ukraine isn't either, but Ukraine agreed to be bound by it. So straight away, there's this nexus there. It's happened on the land, on the territory of a state party or a party that's agreed to be bound by the statute. So there's jurisdiction immediately, ICC jurisdiction immediately. Identified offences by Ukrainian soldiers, so Ukraine forces. Ukraine has an obligation to investigate and an obligation to prosecute if there's a brief there, their own people. Right? We know that. If they won't, then the ICC can step up and they can do it. So
that happened because there's clear evidence from things I've seen of executions of targeting. That is, don't have to be a lawyer, and you don't even have to be a soldier ethically to go, that's not on, that is wrong. It doesn't matter the badge of which militia they're fighting for, or if they're fighting under the Ukrainian armed forces. That's wrong. Has there actually anyone that Ukraine has picked up and gone, you're a Ukrainian soldier fighting on our side, but this is not kosher?
That's a really good question, and in fact, it's a really good juncture to ask it, because the short answer is no. The independent monitoring mission, the UN mission that was in there to monitor any war crimes, etc., in the course of this fight, they found whatever the term is. I think it's identifiable evidence, or they raised a reasonable suspicion that crimes were committed by both Russian forces and Ukrainian forces. Now, they couldn't get into Russia to interview people. They couldn't get nothing. There's a barrier there. They could get into Ukraine. So they said to the Ukrainian government, these are the suspicions. They gave them the brief, and they said, you have an obligation to investigate, and if there's a brief, prosecute. As far as I'm aware, to date, there's been no prosecutions. And the last time I read the last report from that independent monitoring mission, they weren't aware there'd been any investigations either. So, like I say, it goes both ways. We can run around saying, yes, Russia's naughty, Ukraine's a victim in this, and they are a victim of aggression. But at the same time, the obligation is on both sides to comply with the rules of war, or the laws of war as they apply in the conflict. Yeah,
and is this dating back just from the 22nd that no one has been charged, or back from 2014? Because we know that throughout that period of almost 10 years now, that there has been elements of that. And if you're saying that now Ukraine hasn't charged anyone, picked them up, and the ICC have then a obligation to, is the ICC actually going to do that? Or are they going to go back and go, well, the political fallout, we'll see if this, and we'll look like the bad guys. We're not going. Are they actually going to do it?
The allegations are they're in the hands of the Ukrainian prosecutor general. And there's a new prosecutor, not new, he's been there for a couple of years now, Prosecutor General. The other one was sacked by Zelensky. So look, the allegations are there. They have an obligation to investigate. And, as we know, if they don't investigate, or if they say they have, but then it's not a genuine investigation. So that the triggers for ICC jurisdiction, they'll come into play. I suspect that the ICC is sitting back. There's no statute of limitations on this stuff, right? So I suspect they are sitting back, not wanting to tread too heavily at the moment because of the public, the global perception of having Russia as the aggressor and Ukraine as the victim, and not being seen to be going after the victim state when they can't physically go after the aggressor state, and they can't.
My point is more, why should people like me, who's part of the international community, have faith in the ICJ or ICC?
One of the shelves is all about the politicization of the ICC and the political nature of the court. And that's a fact. International courts, the ICJ particularly, but the ICC as well, are a political creature. The ICC is independent of the UN, but the ICJ is a creature of the UN, and the UN, by its own by its own admission, is a political creature. So you're absolutely right, and it is difficult for people to have confidence in those institutions. Alexander Polishchuk, who is the deputy defense minister, right? He came out and said Ukraine's a reliable member of the international community. It commits to all our obligations on mine usage. This includes the non-use of anti-personnel mines. During the war, we strictly adhere to the standards of IHL, blah, blah, blah. But we cannot comment on the types of weapons used during the armed conflict before the end of the war and the restoration of our sovereignty and territorial integrity. So the upshot is Human Rights Watch has done that little process that we just did, and they've interpreted these things to be mines per the Ottawa Convention, which is the same as the mine definition in Protocol 2, and they've said you're in breach. And Ukraine has said we comply with everything, but we're not going to talk to you about it until after the war.
Yeah, it sounds like bullshit, just like him saying they're not using anti-personnel mines.
Like, no, you're right.
In that quote, he said they're not using AP mines, which, like, do we? And my issue on this stuff is that because the West, who's completely overwhelmingly the control of the UN, the ICC, ICJ, because we have said we are pro-Ukraine, we just turn a blind eye to all of this. Like, if anyone can take that quote seriously and say Ukraine is not using AP mines, then they are absolutely talking out their arse. But obviously, neither Ukraine or Russia is holding itself or troops accountable for any of these actions, nor are we, the Ukrainian allies, holding these rules of armed conflict to the letter of the law. And why hold Ukraine to this high standard when, of course, Russia's not holding themselves to it? Well, this should be very obvious, because we're funding the war and we're an allied country to Ukraine who are enforcing these rules globally and attempting to force them also then upon Russia. How can we enforce it somewhere else saying this should be enforced if we're not willing to do it to ourselves or to one of our allied countries? We keep hearing about these NATO forces and NATO standards this, NATO standards that, but these laws are set. And if the West wants to maintain any credibility in the wider sphere of influence, we can't just enforce this when it suits. For example, the use of landmines is 100% Ukraine breaking its signed and ratified landmine treaties, yet no one says anything. So we had this from Reuters a few months back. But first and foremost, Kiev's international partners should clearly and unequivocally state that international criminal law and international humanitarian law apply to all parties of this conflict, not just some. The same holds true even in severely asymmetrical wars like that in Ukraine. Not all states have done this. The UK, France, Canada, and others have been conspicuously silent on the subject. They might, however, consider the example of US war crimes ambassador at large, Beth Schwack, a staunch supporter of accountability efforts in Ukraine, stating the laws of war apply to all parties equally, both the aggressor state and the defender state. This is an equal measure. All parties in the conflict must abide by international law or face consequences. And secondly, states can offer to assist Ukraine in investigations into any alleged crimes. So we have a duty to do this if we want to maintain and hold that rule of law that we set ourselves. Now, let's have a look at Patriot systems. There's been no movement on this, but we have some more coming out from the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba. Now, he's saying that he's not going to be nice anymore. Nice and quiet diplomacy didn't work. And he's from, of course, the top diplomat in Kiev. Now, yes, people may hate me and I may ruin the relationship. The other part of me is saying diplomacy is all about private relations. But then I told that part to shut up. And the part of me that wanted to speak out started speaking up. We've tried everything and nothing seems to work. Now, his team has identified more than 100 available Patriots. Some neighbouring countries have more than one battery guarding a port or airfield. Zelensky has said Ukraine needs 26 to create a total air shield over Ukraine. But Kuleba is initially focused on obtaining 7 as quickly as possible. So 1 for every major city and then 1 that can be like roaming for the front line as well. But these systems that are well over $1 billion per battery and very expensive per shot. We've talked about this. These are not just sitting around. Air defense is one of the most highly sought after things in the world right now. And we keep being told that Russia is going to attack NATO if Ukraine falls or whatever, as well as, around the world, airfields, Navy ports, bases. You can't just not have air defense at them because there's a country in another war somewhere. You still need your own stuff. We'll talk about this. I'm sorry to spoil the birthday party, but who can believe that the mightiest military alliance in the world cannot find 7 batteries of Patriots to provide them to the only country in the world that is fighting ballistic missile attacks every day? And the response to this would be the reason that ballistic missile attacks aren't happening potentially in other areas is because of these systems that are in place. But it is true, Ukraine's the only country that is fighting ballistic missiles of this regard and technology. At least there are others around there. But yes, I guess we'll see. The amount of batteries, still 7 is a hell of a lot. Like I said, these aren't just sitting around, very expensive, and they're going to have to come from the US. That is just what it is. Otherwise, it'll be countries giving up their total amount of air defense capability. Now, number 4 here is from the EU, High Representative Joseph Borrell, who we speak about a bit. I spoke with the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba some days ago, and he is desperately asking for 7 Patriot batteries to protect his country. It should be inconceivable that we are not able to provide them, given that the Western armies have about 100 batteries of Patriot, and still we're not able to provide 7 that they are desperately asking for. So Ukraine has been begging the last months for more air defense in specifically Patriot battery systems, and there really hasn't been much movement on that. And I'd love to know the behind the scenes of what the sticking point actually in here is. Is it the amount that are actually movable that we can't move it off this airbase? Like, how many are actually just in storage somewhere doing nothing, as well as the cost of these has to come into it somewhere. Now, I want to look at these e-bikes. So in Seversk, Spurny, I'll just show you down on the map, of course, down in here. So this is the Seversk front. Then we have Spurny sitting down here. We have seen an attack by Russian forces on these motorcycles across here. Now, they're going across this field. This could work very well. One, your footprint on the ground on a motorcycle is significantly less than a vehicle, like a car. You have 2 tires, you're a much smaller footprint on the ground, like visually as well, much smaller heat signature, all of this. And they'd have this daring operation across this, I should say as well, anti-tank mines won't set off from the weight, or they shouldn't set off on the weight, and then they go in and assault this trench system, and it is said that then the Ukrainian forces have fled out of there. And depending what you read, it was either a success or not a success, but either way, it's just interesting to see these vehicles on the front line. And we are seeing in more armies around the world the use of electronic motorcycles becoming more and more relevant to snipers, reconnaissance, or forward groups. Now, there's a photograph here of Russian special forces on these motorcycles as well here. I can't break down where this actually is. Probably in Africa somewhere with the soft, I'm guessing, but I don't know. Now, this is said to be an EMAX DWX 250 motorcycle here. Now, a lot use either electronic motorbikes or old DRs, things like this, but these are an electronic motorbike, would get around a lot of the thermal problems. Now, so I tried to find out more on these. There's not much. These are Russian built. These are from pre the war. So Russian MX Enduro and Supermoto bikes. I think they made a 250 and a 450, which has no relevance on CCs when it comes to battery. It must be a power output thing for those class, but there's a little bit of information on some of these forums dating back in our 4 years. But I'm guessing that these are the same motorcycles used here. It's interesting to see the development of these. Now, let's then have a look at the map. So, of course, here is Ukraine, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22 and the purple since 2014. Now, you'll notice this map doesn't update on Thursdays my time or Wednesday your time, so there's no movement on any of the deep state fronts. But luckily for you, we have then Syriac maps. Noel Reports also hasn't released any maps for the last 24 hours also. So we have 2 Avdiivka maps sitting here. Situation west of Avdiivka. Russian army took control over the north pond of Berdachi. Meanwhile, the area recently vacated by Ukrainian army north of Vodiani was also taken by Russian forces. So we spoke about these movements yesterday, but let's look at Berdachi. So up here, movement out further to the north up here. But we also spoke that this area down in this, we'll call it the south of the front here, just down to this red dot is Tonenki being here, has really closed up through here. And it is showing that. So we can see that this is Netelyove, so just above Pervomaysky, that this is that funny shaped paddock. So right up, closing up to here, as well as you would have seen on my video yesterday on the thumbnail, I drew that in. So this was the first map update of the day. Wrong way. Let's go left for the first map update that we just looked at. So the left one is the one you just looked at, and the right one is from later on that day, closing up further of this gap just to the north in here. Russian army made new advances south of the Derna River and southeast of Umansk, reaching the outskirts of the locality. So moving pretty quickly through this open territory through here, but will put a hell of a lot of pressure on the second line of defense and places like Umansk and even down to Semenivka with this open territory and grazing fire that can cross as well as direct fire too. So let's just push down. No change, of course, in Krasnohorivka, but we did look at that Russia did have a break-in into these areas yesterday. It'll be very interesting to see how this goes now that there is a break-in and forces present right on the outskirts. How will the urban movement through there go with the support of things like FABs? But we'll come down Novomaylivka. We have seen that Russia has been taking more and more control here. Situation southwest of Donetsk. During the last 2 days, Russian army made some advances in the center part of Novomaylivka. About 70% of the locality is now under Russian control. So right up to see where this dips down. So up into here is then under Russian control. The Noel Reports map is really backing up where that movement is. Of course, another Ukrainian map. I believe this map is behind on that area. Now, we'll just push up into this Seversk front in here. This is the chalk quarry, and we'll have a look at this is Spurny, where we looked at that movement of the motorcycles. I don't know if I can call them a motorcycle, or is it actually a motorcycle because an electric motor is a motor, not an engine? Someone get me on that. But we see this little nub come out here. I've got some nub myself just in this area, but Russian armies restarted operations in this axis and took control over part of the trench system east of this locality. So we do see little bits of movement up here from Syriac, but nothing major. It seems to be very close trench to trench, back and forward in the Seversk front. Now, legends, that is all that I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. Go and watch the full podcast if you'd like. Come and join the Telegram, the supporting links if you'd like to, but look after yourself, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.